I would now like to recognize Chairman Durbin of the Senate Judiciary Committee for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator Peters. This is a rare joint meeting of the two committees, but we have matching jurisdiction, and I think it's the most efficient way to get to the truth. So thank you for letting us join you today. We've all seen the movies. We've read the books. The international assassin with sophisticated technology, elaborate plans, well-honed skills, sets out to kill a leading political figure in the United States. But how does that match the reality of what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, when a 20-year-old introverted college student outsmarted one of the most sophisticated American law enforcement agencies in history, came within an inch of killing a former president of the United States? That's why we gathered today to ask these hard questions. There's more to this story and other aspects that we ought to consider as well. We cannot lose sight of the factor that contributed to the violence on July 13th. Widespread, easy access to AR-15 military-style rifles. While we rely on the Secret Service to protect elected officials, we must acknowledge the unique challenges they face in light of the proliferation of weapons of war on our street. Pennsylvania, like many states, allows individuals to openly carry a loaded rifle without a permit. To make matters worse, assault rifles can easily be purchased from unlicensed dealers without a background check because of dangerous loopholes in our gun laws. This same kind of firearm has been used to carry out mass shootings in Newtown, Uvalde, Las Vegas, and Highland Park, Illinois, killing dozens of children and adults and injuring many more. Looking across this dais, I recognize we have our differences on many issues. But when it comes to the protection of the president and presidential candidates, we should stand united. We know that protecting our elected officials is essential to a functioning democracy. I hope this hearing can be an example of how we will work together on a bipartisan basis to not only understand this shocking event, but to ensure it never happens again. We must do this without the incendiary language and conspiracy mongering that too often dominates our political discourse today. Ongoing investigations by the Secret Service and the FBI are critical, but Congress, the victims' families, and the American people deserve transparency and accountability now. I'll now turn to my partner on the Judiciary Committee, Ranking Member Lindsey Graham.
Thank you, Mr.
Recognizing Mr. Castro for 5 minutes.
Assistant Secretary Robinson, where do the majority of firearms used by cartels in Mexico, Central America, or the Caribbean come from?
Thank you, sir, for that question. The majority of firearms used by criminals in the region come from the United States.
And would you say that lax U.S. gun laws are a foreign policy problem for the United States?
Well, what I would say is the countries in the region, our friends in the region, are challenged to oppose those transnational organizations, criminal organizations, and gangs who are receiving those weapons. And we are challenged here in the United States to help them.
And when countries in the region, particularly the Caribbean, raise their most important priorities with you, this is for Secretary Nichols, how often does the issue of firearms from the United States come up?
Comes up very frequently. We believe that the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was an important step in addressing those concerns. The naming of a special prosecutor in the Department of Justice to lead investigations, the use of technologies like E-Trace, training to partners in the Northern and Southern Caribbean in gun crime investigations has also been responsive to those concerns, but they would certainly, our partners would certainly like us to do even more.
And Secretary Robinson, one important tool we have to track and combat the trafficking of firearms is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms' E-Trace system, which allows law enforcement to submit forensic information from captured weapons like serial numbers to the database. Other countries can also participate and submit information, and many do, but there are significant gaps in coverage in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. The INL Bureau that you lead helps build capacity in foreign law enforcement agencies. What are you doing to help foreign law enforcement agencies participate in the E-Trace system and track the source of firearms?
Thank you. Actually, we are working very closely with our interagency colleagues at the Department of Justice, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and DHS to broaden the spectrum of the use of e-trace, not just in Mexico, but in the Caribbean. I was just there. I was there with the special prosecutor, Michael Ben Avery, to discuss this with our colleagues in the Eastern Caribbean, and we're doing what we can to get more countries to enter the information and the evidence in e-trace.
Well, thank you for that important work. And I raise this issue because we often talk about the very real danger of cartels and the damage that they do, not only in Mexico, but to Americans through the trafficking of fentanyl, trafficking of migrants, because they often force these people to pay a fee to present themselves at the border. But they are powered by American firearms. They would not be able to succeed the way they do but for the use of American firearms. And even though there's a lot of discussion about these issues on this committee, there is not the same will to actually do something about it and disarm the cartels. So there's a lot of, big statements and aggressive statements against the cartels, but actually very weak will to actually do anything about it, to disarm them so that they can't accomplish what they're accomplishing now. I had a second unrelated question on Honduras for you all. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai has said that, quote, President Biden does not believe corporations should receive special tribunals and trade agreements that are not available to other organizations, and he opposes the ability of private corporations to attack labor, health, and environmental policies through investor-state dispute settlements. Does the State Department share the President's position of opposing investor-state dispute settlement policies?
Well, I'll just note that I support the President's policies. The specific reference to Honduras is not something that I've tracked closely, and I would appreciate the opportunity to come back to you for the record with a more specific answer.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Chair now recognizes Mr. Baird for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I appreciate the opportunity.
Without saying thank you so very much to Tiffany for the living example that she is for every one of us. Tiffany is, in so many ways, one of my heroes. She's a mother whose child was killed, and every single day she's gotten up and she's had the courage to continue to fight for others. She decided that she's going to literally change the world as a result of her son's death. And I know that I speak for every single person in this room and every person in Maryland and across our country when I say that the pain that Tiffany endured is one that should have never happened. From schoolhouses to places of worship to grocery stores, gun violence is and has become a pain that is way too familiar, a part of our everyday lives. And the tragic fact, one that is so hard for me to even mention, is that gun violence has become the #1 killer of children in the United States of America. It is said that we are judged as a society by how well we care for children. And it is an indictment on us as a society, therefore, that the #1 way that a child dies in America is not by disease or by accident, but by gun violence. And it is true that every single person in this room has an obligation to change that fact and to make sure that we build for all of our children a future that is free of gun violence. It's too easy, we know this is true, to get your hands on a gun these days. Assault weapons are readily available and flood into our state from other locales. The growing presence of ghost guns, we know, exacerbates what is already an unacceptable reality for all of us. And in fact, Maryland overall has now become the place with the highest rate of out-of-state gun imports in the country. Traffickers today bring nearly 3 times as many firearms into Maryland as the national state average. And gun violence is not only a problem in this state, it's impacting lives all across the nation. The United States gun homicide rate is 26 times that of other high-income countries. And we should never, ever become comfortable with this. And it's not just an issue either for inner cities. I want to be clear about that. You know, so often you hear this is something that happens in the inner city. Well, I want to be clear about something. And I want to share with you that it is not just an issue there. It's also hurting rural America as well. The ever-increasing presence and availability of guns in our communities is an epidemic that is making every single one of our neighborhoods vulnerable. And frankly, right now in this country, there are some leaders who believe that we should just accept this reality. And I am so sorry, not in Maryland. That's why I stood up and ran for state's attorney, to help turn the tide of violence that has become unfortunately normalized. I don't know about you, but for my daughter, I don't want violence to be normalized. It's nothing that we should ever accept. And so as state's attorney, I led a 50% reduction in violent crime while working to tackle the proliferation of guns across our community. And during that time, I advocated strongly for comprehensive gun legislation. I didn't do it alone. There are so many who are in this room today. We have such an excellent legislative delegation who worked on the landmark Firearms Safety Act, which banned most assault weapons, expanded background checks, and required licenses before buying a handgun. Maryland is a leader. And I've continued to stand up against this violence as county executive. We formed a violence prevention task force and implemented their recommendations to interrupt the cycle of violence and to do more to prevent violence before it begins. We've invested in families and worked to create more opportunities for our young people through after-school enrichment programs and internships that lead to great jobs. I've secured grant funding for programs like Hope in Action, Anti-Violence Project that provide community wraparound services, and I'll continue standing against gun violence in the Senate. I'll pass gun legislation, including universal background checks, a ban on military-style assault weapons, and combating illegal firearms trafficking. And as a senator, I'll stand for common-sense approaches to make sure that firearms don't end up in the hands of the wrong people who can't pass a background check. And I want you to know as well that I won't back down from holding gun manufacturers accountable. Our right to hold this industry to account for the immense harm that they have caused our state and our country. And let me be crystal clear. We will not accomplish these goals to keep Americans safe without a Senate majority. And I want you to know that it has become the case that the path to the majority runs through Maryland. And I couldn't be prouder. Let me tell you that I am a part of a team, Team Maryland. Many of my colleagues are here today. I wish to recognize all of my friends and sisters and brothers in elected service who are here today. Can you stand? There's so many. I want to recognize them. And also, I want to recognize the captain of Team Maryland, Governor Wes Moore. I see our delegations there, Senator Van Hollen, so looking forward to being with you. This is an issue that I have dealt with so often as a public servant. But I want you to know that I'm here today because I am also a mother. A mother who realized that my own daughter and her peers had to make adjustments and learn protocols to be safe in the classroom. When we talk about unacceptable realities, it is an unacceptable reality that we send our kids into schools now and then expect them to practice protocols, how to dive under a desk, how to lock the classroom doors from inside. This is a reality that I do not accept. We have placed the burden of really this scourge that is in our country on the backs of children. And we have done so because the adults lack the courage to do anything about this scourge that is overtaking our country. And so it is through this lens that I attended last year as well as a mother, the viewing of a high school girl. Her name was Jada. Jada was an amazing young woman. She was a person whose bright future was cut short by senseless violence as she tried to keep peace between two groups of fighting students. And I attended her viewing, and as I walked up to her casket, I have to tell you, I swear, I could have screamed. I could have screamed. Asking myself, like so many of us, how did we get here? And knowing, like all of you, that it didn't have to happen. Yet the reality is that it does, and that it happens over and over and over again. And more parents are left to grieve their children. And these are not hypothetical policy debates with imaginary characters. These aren't heartaches that I've had to read about. This is personal for me. This is a pain that I have witnessed up close and personal firsthand, and I have observed it too often. And I know that not enough leaders choose courage and action over sending thoughts and prayers. And too many people choose to opt out of this fight, not understanding that this epidemic will soon reach their doorstep if we don't stand up and do something about it. That's why I've stood up to fight back against this violence, and why I'm still standing against it today. And as our leadership grows increasingly farther from the lived experiences of those who've been elected to represent us, it's my mission to keep standing for all of you in the Senate. Because I reject the notion that this path our nation is on is impossible to change. It's not too late for us to give our young people back their childhoods and our families back their safe neighborhoods. But it will take leaders with the courage to stand in order for this to happen. And Tiffany, I want to say this to her, and I want to see where she is in the room. Tiffany, I want you to know I understand. Although maybe we can never understand the path that you are on, but I want you to know that you won't walk a single day of this by yourself. And I want you to know that in the Senate, Tiffany, every time they see me, they're going to also have to see me. But I won't stand alone. The leader that I am about to introduce has always had the courage to stand. You know, years ago when I was initially running for office, I read about a woman, and actually I read about her in Essence magazine. And they were talking about this super incredible leader who had been elected and how she was using these innovative approaches to tackle crime and gun violence. And they were talking about the fact that she had written a book about being smart on crime. And I admired her so much that everywhere I went, I talked about this extraordinary leader and about her innovative leadership. And after I won my election, a couple of days later, I received a call. And she called me, and the first thing that she said to me was, let me know how I can help. And I want you to know that I have never forgotten that, and neither has she. And you better believe I took her up on her offer to help. And she's been helping me all along the way. She showed me the incredible work that she was doing in California to make our community safer. And she never stopped helping, and never stopped leading, and never stopped fighting, and never stopped standing up. You see, that same passion and courage that she's brought to our country, she also has brought to this administration, where she and President Biden have championed and passed the most aggressive gun violence prevention legislation in decades. She's leading the first ever White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. She's a leader who always has had the courage to stand up for what's right. And it's why we are going to re-elect her and President Biden in November. And I don't think she'd mind me saying that she's one super bad woman. and she's never stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my friend, the first woman to be elected Vice President of the United States, Vice President Kamala Harris.
George is recognized. Hey, Kelly.
A.G. Garland, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for all that you have done. And I know that you were just here in September. And I want to commend you for being so responsive to your duties and to the American public. Being the Attorney General is a very difficult job. And still, I am proud of the work that you've done thus far and of your sound judgment, very sound judgment, as you navigate these investigations and requests, as these decisions will set the precedent for attorney generals and others that come behind you in the future. And of those decisions setting a precedent, I would like to focus on a problem plaguing our nation, just as my colleague, Mr. Neguse, did as well, gun violence. We have lost thousands of Americans to gun violence. I just came from another event in the same dealing with gun violence. Yet there are officials and others in power that continue to push back on just simple common sense legislation, rulemaking, and other efforts that can save the lives of our children and our families and keep our communities so much more safe. The DOJ just issued a proposed rule to update the definition of frame or receiver, which would regulate so-called ghost guns, the same as traditional firearms. And this life-saving rule is now being challenged. The DOJ issued a proposed rule to clarify restrictions on short-barreled rifles. This life-saving rule is also being challenged. The DOJ published a rule to update the definition of engaged in business regarding the sale of firearms, and this life-saving rule is also being challenged. Now, I'm all for accountability and transparency and protecting our constitutional rights, but these challenges are not put forth with any of those goals in mind. They are harmful, and they're put in place so that the gun lobby can continue cashing checks regardless of how many lives in this country that we lose every single day. Common sense gun safety legislation does move us to a safer America. And no law enforcement officer in this country, whether they be state or local or federal, should be put in danger because some of our American leaders fail to see the bigger picture of the lives that can be saved and work towards that means. But in this country, we have teenagers who are just too afraid to even go to festivals in their communities anymore or parades because they recognize that it's likely a place that there might be another mass shooting. We have 5- and 6-year-olds in our classrooms that have learned more about active shooter drills than they probably have in their own academics. And we have an entire generation that's growing up thinking that their elected officials don't even care to protect them. I hear from them every single day. And that we're here in Washington only playing politics. And everyone here on this committee should be eager to find ways to protect the American public and to eliminate unlawful guns and the access and possession of them by people who simply should not have them. The steps that the DOJ is taking to clarify and protect those around firearms are the steps that we truly need to keep our community safe. We need to get back on track and worry about the actual issues that are affecting us today. So, A.G. Garland, I sincerely wish that you could be in your office today, really doing your work, the substantive work that you have been duly sworn to do with your team to implement the policies that are needed to protect our country and provide law enforcement with the tools that they need to track down criminals. So if you were not here today, just tell us, what work would you actually be doing instead of being here in front of us again today and having to be put through the ringer one more time?
Well, it's going to take a long explanation, but the day, and I know you don't have time for it, the day begins with a threats briefing from the FBI and intelligence community about the threats this country is facing, both outside the United States and inside the United States. Threats from foreign terrorist organizations, from domestic violent extremists, people intending to commit hate crimes. And we spend that time trying to allocate our resources and orienting our people so that they can deter and disrupt and prevent those attacks. That's what my morning would be, but it looks like we're out of time. So I'm happy to tell you what my afternoon would be if there's more time later.
Once again, I'm so sorry that you're being put through this again, but thank you for the work that you and your staff and all those that are tasked to support you are doing on behalf of the American people. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Garland, thank you for being here today and for your testimony. It will come as no surprise to you that my constituents...
I now yield, and I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. One of the questions, comments that ran through everyone's opening statement was the threat of violence that occurs in this country. And most of those threats have occurred with the use of firearms. Some of us advocate universal background checks for people who own guns. I'm a hunter. I try to get in the woods every chance I get, and every now and then I get lucky and bring something home. But I don't have a problem with whatever the requirements are to own that gun. So, you know, I'm a law-abiding gun owner. So I'd like to ask each witness their position on universal background checks to be able to purchase a gun. Mr. Mays?
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson, for the question. Whether it's background checks or extreme risk protection orders, whatever may be necessary, we would like to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I've spent my career, both in state law enforcement and as a Secret Service agent, encountering people who are suffering from mental illness, people who are homicidal, people who are delusional, and they have guns. And we have very little tools available to take the weapon away. I'm not too worried about law-abiding citizens like yourself who go hunting.
Sure.
It's people who are of limited capacity or have bad intentions, and this is where the mental health piece and the law enforcement piece need to work better together. I've encountered people over my career who are admitting to me that they're mentally ill and depressed, and he's holding a pistol in his hand, and I have to call his dad to come up and try to talk the guy out of the pistol to give it to his dad because I have no way to take it away from him. These are the kind of challenges I have.
I understand, and let me just say that what we did for the federal people in DHS, we passed a specific piece of legislation to help with the mental health of those people because we talked to the family members and other people who were distressed. Sheriff, can you address that?
I have a large agreement with my colleague here. I think the biggest problem isn't so much, it's the people that are criminals that get the guns, and they don't necessarily get them, purchase them properly and the way they should, and with the background checks. We do have background checks, obviously, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I'd have to know the details, quite frankly, of exactly what you mean by universal background check. I think a lot of that's already done within the Commonwealth of Virginia, but my biggest concern is the fact that a lot of these weapons are stolen. They're stolen or used in crimes, and so you can do whatever you want. The fact of the matter is, I think we've got to hold these people accountable that use guns in crimes and prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, rather than constantly trying to change laws that are really only going to impact the honest citizen buying a gun. So,
well, Sheriff, we won't debate it, but an honest citizen can get a gun.
Right.
And I'm just saying that if there's a dishonest citizen, and it may be 5%, 2%, that's one of those steps we can do to mitigate that. Mr. Bullock?
I'd like to hit on what Sheriff just said, which is a large part of what we deal with is stolen firearms. I certainly understand the question about universal background checks. Coming from Texas You know, we definitely like our guns as well. I think that efforts are probably best spent in holding people accountable that are breaking the law very actively, including people that are knowingly using stolen firearms.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bryant?
Likewise, many of my colleagues, I think that universal background checks will assist us in the issues that we're seeing. In many instances, with the level of proliferation of guns that we're seeing on our streets, any aspect that can allow us to minimize what we're seeing will be beneficial, not just to the citizens, but to the law enforcement officers as well.
Thank you very much. One more question. On January 6th, thousands of angry supporters who whipped into a frenzy by the former president marched on the White House to the Capitol, where they broke a police barricade, smashed windows, and assaulted police officers in an attempt to obstruct the democratic process. Over 140 officers protecting the Capitol were injured that day. 5 police officers died in the days and weeks followed. Mr. Mays, do you agree that this violence against police officers was unjustified?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sheriff?
Any violence against police officers doing their job should not be allowed in any sense of the word. So I agree that anybody that does that should be fully prosecuted.
Mr. Bullock?
Take the same stance. Anyone that commits violence towards law enforcement should not be tolerated.
Mr. Bryant?
I agree that any violence against police officers lawfully doing their job should not be tolerated.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
When I worked for Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, I saw firsthand the power of telling our stories. You've just heard mine, but there are many more to tell.
On December 14th, 2012, I walked into Sandy Hook School. I stopped at the office, chatted with my principal, then started my day with my second graders. Suddenly, a loud crash, like metal folding chairs falling. 154 gunshots blaring. Hiding in the coats, trying to sing with my students, trying to read to them, trying to drown out the sounds. Terror, crying, running. I carry that horrific day with me. 20 beautiful first grade children and 6 of my beautiful colleagues were killed. They should still be here.
It's 10:30 a.m. at Robb Elementary in Uvalde. The school is recognizing my 10-year-old daughter, Lexi, for receiving all A's. She receives a Good Citizen Award, and we pose for photos. She wears a St. Mary's sweatshirt and a smile that lights up the room. 30 minutes later, a gunman murders her, 18 classmates, and 2 teachers. We are taken to a private room where police tell us she isn't coming home. Uvalde is national news. Parents everywhere reach for their children. I reach out for the daughter I will never hold again.
My niece, Sandy Patrice, was 22. She drove to Myrtle Beach for sun and fun and motorcycle parades. Hours later, my phone rang. Shooting on the beach. No one can find Sandy. I stayed calm. You see, my mother, Patricia Ann, had been shot and killed by an abusive partner. I was calm then too. I got to handling business. I called relatives, the police, hospitals, and I kept calling, voice steady, heartbeat pulsing. Then I was connected to the coroner. 10 years of waiting, and Sandy's murder is still unsolved. I'll keep calling, and I'll keep fighting.
I was in high school when my classmate got shot. It changed my story. Instead of worrying about taking a test, I started worrying about living to take another test. They say schools are for learning, and I did learn a lot that day. I learned how to run, how to hide and drop, that what happens in the news can happen to me. But I learned something else too, that we can write and must write a new story if we choose to.
Are stories of loss. But make no mistake, our losses do not weaken us. They strengthen our resolve. We will secure safer futures that we all deserve. We will organize. We will advocate. We will run for office. And we will join with Americans from small towns and big cities to keep our communities safe. And we will elect leaders like Kamala Harris, who won't just empathize, but will act. Question? You're up against a majority who have been very reluctant to cooperate on this issue. What about this do you think will be different, and why are you hopeful that this will go through?
Well, you know, I am not under any illusion that they are going to cooperate, but we are appealing to the American people as well. We want the American public to know that despite our Republican colleagues' unwillingness to do what is right and to protect the safety of their communities, we're not going to stop. We're going to continue to build upon the work that we've done. There are advocates and gun safety organizations all around the country that stand with us, and we're doing tremendous work. When I came into gun safety advocacy 10 years ago, I can tell you the countless number of times I would go to testify in state legislatures or to even come here and testify before the United States Senate. And there would be no one there with me. There would be no one to really help encourage me or encourage common sense gun safety legislation policy. But that's changed now. That has definitely changed now. There's not one mother, father, there's not one family in any community that I know of that is happy with the scourge of gun violence in our country. It is a public health crisis. It is an epidemic. And so we know and believe that we are doing the right thing. We are saving lives. And we'll continue to champion forward. But we will also continue to let the American public know that it is not us that holds up progress. And I'm hoping that our Republican colleagues will take heed to the voices of the people. Over 90% of the American public want common sense gun safety legislation. They believe there must be a balance of rights, gun rights, protecting Second Amendment gun rights with a balance of common sense measures to keep people safe.
And let me just add, this is the process. We could avoid the discharge petition altogether if the Republican leadership would bring up before the body a vote on the bills that we on the task force and the American people know will make our communities safer and will save lives. But they've chosen not to. They've decided they're not going to bring any gun violence prevention legislation up. As a matter of fact, they've exacerbated things by removing the Veterans Administration from being able to ascertain information on veterans that are a danger to themselves or others. They've, in legislation, in an amendment that they passed, they stopped that from being able to take place at a time when 20 veterans a day are taking their own lives. So this is what we have. This is the only tool that we have through the rules of the House and the legislative process to be able to free this measure up that we know saved lives for a vote from the House of Representatives to bring it into law.
If I could just say one thing, that's where all of you come in. You know how hard we're working. This is my, I think, third gun violence press conference this month. You see familiar people and sometimes more legislators, sometimes less, depending on committee. And that's how we need the media to come in to talk about what we're doing and talk about why we have not made more progress. Because as you've heard, what we're trying to do has saved lives, does save lives, and will save lives. Mr. Speaker, I rise today because America has a gun problem. Every week, my constituents wake up to news of another shooting, another life cut short, another family torn apart. Doing nothing about this crisis is not an option. Year after year, the United States leads the developed world in gun deaths, but lags far behind in meaningful policy solutions. When I first came to Washington, I published the 2014 Kelly Report on gun violence in America. This first-of-its-kind report framed gun violence as a public health crisis and offered solutions that truly matched the scale of the epidemic. Unfortunately, 10 years later, gun violence still claims tens of thousands of lives every year. Since 2014, guns have become the #1 cause of death for children and teens. Gun violence is killing a generation and robbing communities of future leaders, teachers, doctors, artists, and more. 10 years later, I am once again bringing together survivors, advocates, experts, and my fellow members of Congress to say enough is enough. I produced the 2024 Kelly Report to chart a path for the work yet to be done. My wish is that this will be the last Kelly Report on gun violence I need to write. My wish is that our country will see a future where children can safely walk to the park, a high school student can safely pick up her friends, and a father can safely play basketball with his son in their driveway. Americans should not have to live in constant fear of becoming another deadly statistic. Thoughts and prayers are not substitutes for policy and action. I hope that this report not only sheds light on the public health crisis that is gun violence in America, but also provides a meaningful roadmap to create change and save lives. I also want to take this time to acknowledge Megan Thompson. Megan has served in my office as Senior Health Policy Advisor and has done a remarkable job advancing health equity, access to care, and innovative treatment options during her time in this role. Her contributions to my office have gone beyond policy expertise. Megan's joy and enthusiasm brings light to our whole office. While we will miss Megan in the office, I have no doubt that she will continue to excel in her next endeavor. I know that Megan's work will continue to make a difference for years to come. And last but not least, please fund Ukraine. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first week of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas's spring semester, a time when students should be excited to see their friends after winter break and faculty to begin to review the syllabus with an eager class. But sadly, this won't be a typical week back for the students of UNLV. That's because this first week is the first week that students will be returning to in-person classes since last month's horrifying shooting, in which a gunman took the lives of 3 professors and critically wounded a 4th. Thousands of students and faculty members were forced to huddle in classrooms behind locked and barricaded doors, waiting for hours to find out whether their campus was safe or not. Immediately after the shooting, I and many of my colleagues demanded once again that Congress do something, just anything, to curb our nation's gun violence epidemic. And since then, our country has witnessed another 70 school shootings. That's in just 6 weeks. But how many pieces of legislation to address gun violence have been brought to the floor in that time? 0. It's shameful. Instead, our far right has played partisan games to score cheap political points, threatening a government shutdown and completely dismissing the very real fear that students and educators at UNLV and across the country feel each and every day. That fear should not be normal. Nevadans are tired of it, and so am I. I want my colleagues to work together to end this 6th cycle of gun violence. Please honor these victims with action. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year set the record for the highest number of mass murders with a firearm in more than a decade. In fact, 2023 marked yet another year where there were more mass shootings than days in the year. More mass shootings than days in a year. These events continue to re-traumatize our communities and our nation because no community has been untouched by this deadly epidemic. One common denominator in these mass murders is the use of large-capacity ammunition feeding devices or high-capacity magazines. These magazines hold 30, 40, or even 100 rounds of ammunition, and they've been used in all 10 of our nation's deadliest mass shootings. High-capacity magazines increase a shooter's ability to kill or injure large amounts of people quickly. One event that I still remember starkly is the shooting in Aurora, Colorado at the movie theater, which is just a few miles from my home. One single perpetrator used an assault rifle and a 100-round magazine to fire 65 shots within just minutes, killing 12 people and injuring 70 others. Despite the fact that many members of the audience for that movie were either active duty military or veterans who were trained to respond to a situation just like this, they were unable to respond because the volley of bullets was simply too extreme. The high-capacity magazine allowed that shooter to continue firing, pinning people down as shot after shot rang out. There are so many more examples of this terrible, terrible destruction. Columbine, also right outside my district, Dayton, Las Vegas, Parkland. No other developed country experiences this level of violence from firearms. Now, I recognize there's not one single piece of legislation that will completely end gun violence. But something must be done. In mass shootings with 4 or more people killed between 2015 and 2022, high-capacity magazines led to more than twice as many people being killed and nearly 10 times as many people being wounded per incident on average. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if you have just a few rounds of ammunition, then those highly trained soldiers and veterans in that movie theater audience would have been able to stop the shooter, tackle him, and disable him after he stopped shooting. But instead, when you can shoot up to 100 rounds in rapid fire, this is not possible. High-capacity magazines, they were designed for war. They weren't designed for hunting. They weren't designed for self-defense. But yet, they continue to be used against our fellow citizens in our hometowns and communities. So experts agree, reinstating the limit on high-capacity magazines would be an effective step in protecting our communities. Today, Representatives Titus and Schneider, along with the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and I, are announcing that we're filing a discharge petition to bring the Keep Americans Safe Act up for a vote so we can reinstate the U.S. ban on high-capacity magazines. My bill would prohibit the sale or transfer of any high-capacity magazine capable of holding more than 15 rounds of ammunition. This is legislation that's been passed by this chamber 2 times last year, 2 years ago, as part of the assault weapons ban and the Protecting Our Kids Act. It is our obligation as members of Congress to keep the American people safe and to protect our communities. Now's the time to reinstate the limit on high-capacity magazines. The petition will now be filed at the desk, and I urge all of my colleagues to sign it. It will take 218 signatures to bring this bill to the floor and to move us one step closer to eradicating the terrible, terrible ravages of gun violence for the American people. I yield back.
Pennsylvania seeking recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
You're recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to applaud Surgeon General Vivek Murthy for officially calling our gun violence epidemic what it is, a public health crisis. The numbers paint the picture. 120 Americans are killed and more than 200 are wounded by guns every day. The leading cause of death among children and teens in America is gun violence. 4,600 precious children killed in 2022 alone, an average of 2 mass shootings each day for the past 3 years. These numbers should horrify us because they are not numbers. They're people whose lives have been stolen, families with unimaginable pain. Dr. Murthy's declaration treats our gun violence crisis with the urgency it demands. It opens doors for us to build upon the small progress we are making. 2 years ago this week, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first gun violence safety law in 30 years. We did so together in the shadow of a horrific set of mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde. This will not be our last step. We must ban automatic rifles, strengthen universal background checks, and require safe storage. This is a public health crisis. Mr. Speaker, I ask us to face it. Doing so will save lives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Expired. Purpose, does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the time I'm done speaking, 11 people will have died from gun violence in our country. By the end of the day, it'll be 120. If we continue down this trajectory, more than 43,000 people will die from gun violence this year. This legislative body needs to take more action beyond thoughts and prayers. I introduced the Wear Orange resolution this Gun Violence Awareness Month in honor of Hydea Pendleton. She would have turned 27 years old this month, but her life was cut short at 15 when she was shot and killed. Every time I rise to urge Congress to pass common sense gun safety laws, I remember Hadiya, who should have been safe at a park. 2 years ago, we passed the first federal gun safety legislation in nearly 30 years. We could not wait another 30 years. It has only been a minute, and 11 more people have died from gun violence. I yield back.
Yields back. For what purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I rise today because this week the Biden administration took yet another massive step in the fight to end gun violence and save innocent lives. Yesterday, the administration took historic action to reduce the number of firearms sold to people without background checks. This is the largest expansion in the history of the background check system, or in the past 30 years. From Columbine to the Midland Odessa shooting, background check loopholes and unlicensed gun dealers have contributed to some of the most horrific and senseless tragedies of our time. For years, people across our country have marched and fought and raised their voices, calling on leaders in power to give a damn about the innocent lives being taken away from us. President Biden is listening. Under his leadership, this Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Under his leadership, we've created the first ever federal White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and under his leadership, we are one more massive step closer to universal background checks that will undoubtedly save lives. Now it's time for this chamber to follow suit and pass universal background checks. I yield back the balance of my time.
Syracuse Minoa Central High School, Eddie Michaelenko, and I want to thank him for where he is. Okay, thank you for hosting us here today. This is a difficult day. I just walked through the halls of this great school, had a chance to engage with some really smart young people who are so excited and energetic and happy to be back at school with an extraordinary teacher teaching them coding and teaching them cyber and teaching them everything they need to know in the space of computer science. But you turn on the news and you are stunned to see yet another school shooting in the United States of America. It hurts on so many levels. As a parent who for many years sent my children off to school, I know the inherent anxiety as soon as your beloved children are out of your sight. And then to see news stories where a 14-year-old has access to an assault-style weapon, a military-style assault weapon. How he got his hands on that remains a question. But to gun down students in a school, 2 students, 2 adults, wounding 9 more. We've had enough. This nation has seen enough. We have done a lot in the state of New York to protect our citizens from gun violence. We have tough laws, some of the toughest in the nation. We feel confident that they do protect our citizens, and especially the enhancements we made in the aftermath of the brutal slaying of 10 Western New Yorkers shopping at a Tops grocery store. Many of them are my neighbors. We enhanced our red flag laws. Red flag laws are the early warning system that is necessary for law enforcement to understand that there could be someone who would do harm to themselves or to others and intervene before you have a tragedy like we saw in Georgia, where they can appeal to getting if there's access to guns, getting them out of the hands of an individual who could do harm to others. That should be a national policy. There should be a national red flag law or extreme risk order of protection. We have issued over 20,000 in the state of New York in the last 2 years. That's up from about 1,000 before we changed the law and put the onus on law enforcement to really engage and be held responsible for taking the steps necessary. When the red flag is risen, go to that person's home, see if there's access to guns, see what they're saying online. Do everything you can to preemptively, proactively prevent violence and the slaughter of innocent citizens, especially our children in schools. We also need a national assault weapons ban. We had one in place. We'll never know how many lives were saved because we did not have them so readily accessible, where an 18-year-old in New York State could walk into a store and buy it on his birthday. We have to regain our sensibilities here in America. We really do. And that's what I'm calling for, national action. I know that the Biden-Harris administration wants to do more. I know that the Senate, led by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, wants to do more. And I'm calling on the Republican-led House of Representatives to stop putting up roadblocks to saving children's lives. How many more deaths will it take? How many more wake-up calls do we have to have? How many more times do we have to turn on a television and just have that gut-wrenching feeling in our hearts that something has to change, and it hasn't. So coming to a school.
Without objection, the gentleman is now recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, my heart is heavy. I'm brought back to this moment in history where in June 12th, 2016, 49 angels were murdered in cold blood on the dance floor and on the floor of Pulse nightclub in my city, in my district, and in my home of Orlando, Florida. I'm angry. I'm angry that we live in a world and that we live in a country where gun violence can drastically change or end your life. I'm angry that I serve in a chamber where seemingly most of the folks here don't want to do a single damn thing about it. And I'm angry that I've been fighting for this since I was 15, and we're still in this fight. And so I just want to express my condolences and send immense amounts of love to the families and to the survivors of the Pulse Night Massacre, and tell y'all that we will continue to honor the lives of those 49 angels with nothing but action, with nothing but sweat equity, until we end gun violence in this country, because true justice isn't one person behind bars. It's when we can wake up with the confidence to say that this will never happen again. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the
So pivoting a little bit, this is an issue that I personally very much care about. I've worked on a lot, especially having a family member that experienced gun violence. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, gun violence in America is top of mind for so many people right now. Yeah. And there is no place for political violence or gun violence in our nation. Last year, I was proud to advocate for new laws that were passed here in Michigan. I advocated as a gun owner, a responsible gun owner, including a red flag law, universal background checks, and expanding them, and a safe storage law. But we know that we still need additional reasonable gun safety laws at the federal level. How are you and President Biden working to address gun violence in America?
So, Olivia, you've been a great leader on this, and I'm sorry for the personal tragedies that you've experienced. Gun violence in America today is the #1 cause of the death of children in America. Think about that. The #1 cause of the death of children in America is gun violence. Not car accidents, not some form of cancer, gun violence. Today in our country, 1 in 5 Americans has a relative, a family member who was killed by gun violence. And it doesn't have to be this way. And it's a false choice for people to say, well, you're either in favor of the Second Amendment or you want to take everyone's guns away. I'm in favor of the Second Amendment. I'm also in favor of the assault weapons ban, of universal background checks, red flag laws, right? And to your point, the leadership here in Michigan has been extraordinary on this. And we need people in Washington, D.C. to watch what you all have done and how you've done it, because you've also pulled together coalitions of people, Democrats and Republicans and independents. That bill doesn't care who you're registered to vote with. Think about this. And then think about it in terms of the trauma. So last fall, I started a college tour. By the way, I love Gen Z. If you have Gen Z in your life, maybe it's complicated for you, but they're really great. They're really great. And among the many things that I would ask, these auditoriums full of these young leaders, I would ask them, raise your hand
if at any time between kindergarten and 12th grade you had to endure an active shooter drill. It was bone-chilling. Almost every hand went up. Think about that. You know, when I was growing up, I'll speak for some of us here, I think, we had fire drills. But this is a whole other thing. And our young people think there should be in the classroom experiencing the wonders of the world, and some part of their brain is concerned that someone will bust through that classroom door. And think about the trauma that gun violence has exacted not only on our young people who are afraid of what might happen in the context of a mass shooting. Think of the trauma in terms of everyday gun violence that happens in places around our country. That trauma being undiagnosed and untreated. There are so many permeations and ramifications of this gun violence. In fact, we just announced a couple days ago, under the president and our administration, we created 988. In fact, I'd encourage everyone here to know about it and pass it on. And it's basically a crisis line where people who are in crisis, it's not only a talk line, but there are mental health professionals who answer it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anonymously. So people can text or call when they're experiencing crisis to bring it down and also to know where to get help. But these are all the ramifications of this. And the solutions don't really require that much creativity. What they do require is people in the United States Congress to have courage to act and do what we know is the right thing to do and not cower based on special interest and powerful lobbyists who are encouraging them to do something that actually is contrary to what is the health and well-being of our nation on such a specific issue.
Chair Johnson, and thank you so much, Director Ray, for your transparency and your testimony today. First, I want to say my friend, my mentor, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, was known by many as the voice of reason here in Congress. And she was my friend before I even came to Congress. And in my freshman year, she kind of took me under her wing and she kind of showed me the ropes. And she was a force to be reckoned with. And I can say that she will never, ever be replaced. And she was a trailblazer, and I know that she will sorely be missed here in Congress. Director Ray, I only have one question for you today, but before we get to that point, I'd just like to reiterate today that political violence is never acceptable. Regardless of how different our political values and views are, attempted assassinations are a stain to the very democratic ideals of this nation. We have endured riots on Capitol Hill on January 6th, where a literal noose was erected on Capitol grounds, intended for then Vice President Pence and Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. Political violence against election workers, that has been expressed today. An attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband. Threats against the FBI agents, as you have expressed, and prosecutors, and threats to the staff who serve the public every single day. Congressman Connolly's staff was targeted and attacked last year. And now we have the attempted assassination of a former president of the United States. All of this within just the last 3 years. This violence simply needs to end. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump was, by the grace of God, a failure. The weapon the 20-year-old man was able to obtain, an AR-15, generally has a shooting range up to 600 yards and shot Mr. Trump from almost 150 yards away. This weapon has the ability to kill multiple people in seconds. And sadly, Corey Compatore lost his life because of this man and because of this gun. Mr. Compatore's family will never be the same. Trust me, I understand that more than anyone else in this room. Is the near loss of a former president enough for this Congress to finally take action? because there are 206 of us that are already standing in the wings, ready to take immediate action to ban assault weapons today. We need only 12 more of our colleagues to join us in courage and move the legislation to save lives of so many of the people that we are elected to serve by removing assault weapons from the hands of people who simply should not have them in their possession. We are crippling our democracy, and we are ripping apart our fellow Americans until we do. I ask today, because it is clearly it wasn't enough to take action when the lethality of assault weapons, we lost 26 and 7-year-olds and 6 teachers in 2012, when I also lost my son to gun violence, or 14 teenagers and 3 more teachers in 2018, nor was it enough when we lost 19 more children and 2 more teachers in 2022. Well, is it enough now? Now that a former president, the very president that many of you in this room are hoping will be reelected, almost lost his life because this Congress has failed to reinstate an assault weapons ban. A ban that, by the way, Republicans joined with Democrats to pass 30 years ago. Well, fine. If y'all don't like assault weapons ban, we can bring another bill that I have introduced to a vote, the Go Safe Act. This bill focuses on the components of the semi-automatic firearms and regulates their infrastructure, sale, and transfer. This, again, is not the time for thoughts and prayers. This is a time for action. Director Wray, just one question I have for you. Would you rather have your officers protected or protect someone against an assault weapon being shot from 147 yards away, or a standard pistol with no accessories attached?
Well, again, I'm going to refrain from appearing to comment on specific legislative proposals, but I can tell you that we have certainly concerned about the danger to law enforcement from any kind of high-powered weapon in the wrong hands. And it hits close to home for us because just not that long ago, 2 great agents, Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alphen, down in Miami, executing a search in a crimes against children case, were shot and killed by a subject with an automatic weapon. So again, dangerous weapons in the wrong hands is something that, of course, from a law enforcement perspective concerns us, but I'm not going to wade into the legislative process.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'd rather give our agents a fighting chance, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Tlaib from Michigan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director, for being here. You know, when we hear the headline, a 20-year-old young man with access to an assault weapon commits an act of mass violence, I mean, we've heard this before, over and over again. But the unfortunate thing is that my residents don't get a committee hearing. We have not had one committee hearing about the over 260 mass shootings that we've had, killing hundreds of people, injuring hundreds, changing their lives forever. And don't get me wrong, to many of my colleagues, I mean, I watched, and even the pool of blood, the screams, it was horrific. But it made me think about the images I saw after mass shootings at schools, grocery stores. I mean, I think of Buffalo, New York at a supermarket where a racist gunman killed 10 shoppers with an AR. In El Paso, AK-47 style assault rifle killed 22. In Florida, in Parkland, Florida, 17 students and teachers murdered, again with an AR. In Pittsburgh, at a place of faith, Tree of Life Synagogue, 11 murdered. And don't get me about Newton, Connecticut, which still breaks my heart. 26 murdered, including 20 elementary school children. This year in Michigan, we've had, Mr. Chair, 2 mass shootings. 21 shot in Detroit. One of the most horrific shootings we've seen. 2 killed at a splash pad in Rochester Hills, Michigan. 8 shot there. Again, an assault weapon used. But the difference here is the former president gets a hearing in his attempt to assassinate, but our residents don't get a hearing about mass shootings, about gun violence in our country. You know, Mr. Chair, I ask this wholeheartedly. You know, they don't have Secret Service to protect them. They don't. I don't have these mass agencies protecting our kids in the schools or the supermarket, movie theaters, or going to a block party in Detroit. I don't have that. We don't have that. But I can't believe we're just going to focus on that and not the fact that we're hearing yet again in the headlines a 20-year-old young man having access to an assault weapon, a weapon of war many of my veterans say they have to be trained to use. But he can get it, wasn't safely stored by the parent, grabbing that gun, and innocent lives were lost. Director, I know you got asked about this. And I think it's important, though, you know, for us to hear this. But how difficult is your job when there's such easy access to assault weapons in the streets?
I think the job of a Secret Service agent and officer is incredibly difficult. I think the environment we deal with every day and the dynamics of the threat environment is incredibly difficult. These are brave men and women who put their lives on the line. And a day like we had on July 13th is a day that no one in my agency ever wants to have as their responsibility. It is an incredibly difficult job.
Yeah, I immediately thought of the children in the audience. I mean, when you think about going to a rally with your family, again, their lives are forever changed. The incident are never isolated. I really believe these incidents are never isolated. And I know Detroit Free Press had reported that the 20-year-old Pennsylvania shooter looked up the 2021 Oxford High School shooting in Michigan. Can you comment on what information this shooter was looking up regarding the tragedy of Oxford High School, where it took 4 of our high school youth there?
I'm sorry, I'm not able to. The FBI has those details.
So you can't even tell us, I mean, was he looking at the type of weapon? How many?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have those details.
Do you have, I mean, did they share that with you, though?
I don't have the full content of what his searches were. I think that they are still in the process of examining all of his devices.
Okay. Again, you know, the impact, I want to be really serious about this. The impact on our families is more than just this political rally, Mr. Chair. We have to talk about this, even if we're in disagreement. Let's talk about it, because I've seen statistics that show that we could be saving lives now if we ban these weapons of war from being able to buy it at the local store down the street. I mean, we just can't continue to allow this to happen. And unfortunately, my residents are not former presidents of the United States. They don't get a hearing. They don't get Secret Service, any of that. And even among those that are expressing the failed in the system, they just deserve better. They truly do. Thank you, and I yield.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Burchett from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Cheadle, the shooter.
I thank my colleague for yielding. I must say, you know, Police Week was something that, when I was a prosecutor at the federal level and at the state level, was something I looked forward to. I worked closely with police officers, local, state, and federal. They worked together as brothers and sisters in coordination and cooperation with prosecutors. And in many instances, they had task forces where the federal and local worked together, knowing that that was the way that made them most effective. So it was deeply disappointing to see the bills that came through this week that are supposed to be honoring police officers for Police Week. And some of these came through the Judiciary Committee beforehand, which I sit on. And so I raised objections at the time with respect to this legislation, which was ignored. And so it's with a heavy heart, frankly, that I rise today, because I think it's very clear. I think one of the Republican speakers a few minutes ago noted that, I think he said 370 police officers have been shot. And it's clear that one of the greatest dangers police officers face on the street is from guns. And so the irony of the fact that the legislation that the Republicans have proposed do nothing about guns, in fact, don't even mention them in most cases, is really shocking. Now, my colleague from Massachusetts just mentioned a few minutes ago the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, H.R. 715, and he noted that the sponsor of that is a Republican, but he's the only Republican to join this bill. The other of the 207 co-sponsors are all Democrats, and I think that speaks volumes about where the Republicans are these days on this kind of issue. The H.R. 2870, the Raise the Age Act, which is aimed at bolstering public safety by raising the age for individuals to buy assault weapons from 18 to 21. Common sense legislation that's already 21 for handguns. Why wouldn't we do it for assault weapons? Well, guess what? We don't have one Republican co-sponsor for that legislation. And another example, H.R. 4992, that goes to ghost guns. And the issue about ghost guns is that they're totally untraceable firearms. So they've become the weapon of choice for criminals across the country, blue states, red states, Democratic and Republican jurisdictions alike. Zero Republican co-sponsors for that legislation. So it's with, I say, great disappointment that we come here today and we speak about Police Week, and we ought to be doing things to protect police officers from dangers on the street, but absolutely nothing that's in the legislative package that's being proposed would do that. And just one last point before I yield back. The defund language, none of that's pending legislation with respect to police in the Congress right now. The only defund language that I've seen right now is defund ATF
Gentleman's
and FBI.
time. Gentleman's time
I
has
yield the
expired.
gentleman an additional 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. Those are sponsored by Republicans. The defund the ATF bill is one sentence long. And so when I raised the question with the gentleman who proposed it in the committee, I said, how in the world is that supposed to work? How would you defund the entire ATF knowing that we've got gun cases pending there now, and same with the FBI, international prosecutions, cartels and the like, you would just shut them down like that? That's what those bills would do. Talk about irresponsible. That's what that proposal is right now. So let's get serious. We're facing major challenges. By the way, crime's going down in cities across the country. You mentioned the 2019 statistics. You stay with 2019 because violent crime has been going down in jurisdictions, including the District of Columbia, this year as well. So let's get serious. Let's focus on doing things that really help protect police officers and make the most out of Police Week. And with that, I yield back to my colleague.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great sadness that I rise to honor the victims of the horrific mass shooting that rattled the Birmingham community over the weekend. On Saturday night, just after 11 p.m., 21 people were shot in Birmingham's 5 Point South Entertainment District. 4 of them tragically lost their lives. Let me be clear. This indeed is a senseless violence and unacceptable, and it must stop. Our thoughts are with the families as they endure this unimaginable loss. Nothing compares to the pain of losing a loved one to gun violence. We stand with them in this time of great sadness, and we pray for speedy recovery for those that were injured. I join in expressing my gratitude to the police officers and first responders, as well as our county, state, and federal partners for their quick response. My staff and I have been closely monitoring the situation, and we stand ready to assist the city of Birmingham in any way that we can. While this horrific tragedy has focused the eyes of the nation on Birmingham, Alabama, the surge of gun violence is a reality that far too many of my constituents endure every day. Our communities are crying out for change, and we as elected officials owe it to them to do all that we can at every level of government to keep them safe. Again, I want to be clear. This senseless violence is unacceptable, and it must stop. That means bringing more resources to community organizations fighting to break the cycle of violence. It means teaching our children about alternatives to gun violence. And yes, it means passing common sense measures to keep weapons off the streets of America. Mr. Speaker, our thoughts and prayers are important. They are needed. but they will not bring back the lives of those lost to gun violence, nor will they prevent such tragedies from happening again. The members of this body cannot continue to sit by as family after family, community after community are torn apart. It is time for Congress to finally pass universal background checks, red flag laws, and a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. It is also time for state officials in the state of Alabama to reverse the permitless carry law, which has allowed the unchecked proliferation of guns on our streets. Only by taking meaningful action can we stem this needless loss of life. I ask my colleagues to keep the entire Birmingham community in your prayers, and I hope that we can come together and turn this pain into purpose and do something about it. Thanks, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman Years.
Chairman, I'll start off by echoing the opening statement that Mr. Alford said. We do work here because what happens in small businesses across this country is happening in every district. It's why we come together and talk about these problems, how to make sure our small businesses are thriving. They continue to be the backbone of the American economy. We're talking about Main Street today. In fact, the title of today's hearing is Crime on the Rise, How Lawlessness is Affecting Main Street America. So I want to talk to you about my district in Louisville, Kentucky. On our literal Main Street, in Main Street, downtown Louisville, Kentucky, USA, we have an Old National Bank branch. Old National Bank, a local bank, the local people who work there lend to local businesses. On Monday morning, April 10th of last year, the morning after Easter, our community was rocked when an employee walked in and shot 14 people, killing 5 of them, including a police officer who miraculously survived an AR-15 round to the head. The young man who did this was under psychiatric care, but still 6 days before the shooting, he was able to walk into a store and purchase an AR-15 and all the ammunition he needed in under an hour. See, we're talking about crime, but we can't talk about crime and not talk about guns. Gun deaths and injuries cost Kentucky $9.6 billion each year. Each year, $183.4 million is paid directly by the taxpayers. The Chamber of Commerce says that larceny cost Kentucky $1.5 billion last year. Not great, but it's not 9.6. See, gun violence, it pervades every aspect of our lives. It's unthinkable that we're talking about this with gun violence in schools and small businesses in rural America, in urban America. In 2024, in the U.S., there have already been 1,137 gun violence-related deaths and 7 mass shootings. You guys, we are 11 days into 2024, and there have been 7 mass shootings. Gun violence, we know, is bad for our communities. It's bad for families. It's bad for kids. It's bad for everyone impacted. We know the emotional toll. Today's focus highlights the economic impact. And yes, it's bad for business. But luckily, we can do something about it. We can have an assault weapons ban. We can have waiting periods. We can have extreme risk protection orders or red flag laws. We can actually have background checks, safe storage requirements, magazine limits. These are things we can do in the United States Congress that will help prevent crime and gun violence deaths. Just this past November, 216 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted to prohibit funding for the CDC's firearm injury and mortality prevention research. We can do something, guys. And we must, because it is impacting all of our communities and all of our small businesses. Dr. Roman, I want to ask you, because I understand your research focuses on using data to better fight gun violence. With that vote against the CDC, how does prohibiting funding from critical research agencies that collect gun violence data make the gun violence epidemic better or worse?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Thank you for asking it, because
what we want to do is to make data available to allow policymakers to make the evidence-based, data-driven decisions, including all of the other considerations that you have. So, for example, when you talk about trying to keep the hands out of the young man who committed this atrocity in Louisville, if you look at the data that California gets in terms of access to people who have been detained in a mental health facility, that would go into their data systems. The federally licensed firearm dealers would know that this person had been in that system and was not allowed to purchase a weapon. In most states around the country, those data exchanges do not take place. That data is not kept. It is not transmitted. They do not know that this person is prohibited from buying a weapon because the data are insufficient to do that.
Thank you. I see I'm almost out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in devastation and anger following the shooting at Appalachia High School, the deadliest outbreak of school violence in Georgia's history. As a father, I'm heartbroken. As a congressman, I'm beyond frustrated that our work to improve school safety can't keep pace with the gun violence epidemic that is plaguing our country. The time for thoughts and prayers is over. It's time for action. Our kids deserve much more from the United States Congress. Guns are the leading cause of death of children in this country. This isn't normal, and it shouldn't be. Our students, families, and communities deserve to feel safe from gun violence. That means taking action, not just talking about it, and I believe we can do that together with responsible gun owners. I'm a responsible gun owner. We want common sense measures too, universal background checks, safe storage laws, and banning assault weapons. These are mainstream ideas supported by the vast majority of the American people. They're about saving lives. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker. We will not accept mass murder and gun deaths to be the norm. Mass school shootings are not a fact of life. We don't have to live this way. This year, I had the opportunity to go to Parkland, Florida, with Congressman Moskowitz, where we met with survivors of the deadly 2018 shooting to hear their stories. They lived through their worst, and yet they keep pushing for change. But we've failed to do our part in the few short years since that horrific school shooting. Even when the majority of the American people agree on how to move forward. In April 2023, in a survey from Fox News, they found overwhelming support for common sense gun violence prevention measures. Over 80% of Americans support background checks, making 21 the legal age to buy guns, and requiring mental health checks on all gun buyers. In Congress, I'm part of the House Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and co-sponsor of the bipartisan Background Checks Act. It's simple. If you want to buy a gun, you should have to pass a background check. That applies to sales between private parties, too. Right now, there are loopholes that lets guns slip into the wrong hands. That has to end. I've also co-sponsored the assault weapons ban. No civilian needs an assault rifle. These weapons belong on the battlefields, not in our schools, and not in our neighborhoods. There's also Ethan's Law. This is about accountability. It promotes the safe storage of firearms so they don't end up in the hands of kids. It's about being responsible for your weapon, for your family, and for your community. I support a ban on high-capacity magazines, and I support closing the boyfriend loophole. That's the one that lets domestic abusers buy guns. Domestic violence and gun violence are often linked. This loophole costs lives. And let's not forget mental health. We need to fund mental health care and expand access to it. But mental health alone isn't the issue. This is also about guns. We need to act now. We need to keep our kids, our neighbors, and our communities safe. No more delays. Over 40,000 people lost their lives to gun violence last year alone. No more excuses. Massacres carried out using the high-capacity magazines and bump stocks must end. No more indifference. Poor and minority communities cannot continue to be disproportionately impacted by gun violence. No more inaction. Over 20,000 Americans die by gun suicide every year, which is why we mark tomorrow, September 10th, Firearms Suicide Prevention Day. No more deadly outcomes. Domestic violence should never turn fatal because of easy access to guns. We've waited long enough. It's time to act. There's no question that gun violence is out of control, and it's time we face it head on. I'll work with anyone, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, to make sure that happens. It's not just about policy, it's about people. And people are dying. We can't wait any longer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak about ghost guns. They have been called the IKEA of firearms. You can order them online and in less than an hour have a firearm as deadly as any sold by a gun dealer. These fully functioning, untraceable firearms can be bought without a background check, and they're wreaking havoc on our communities. That's why they've become the weapon of choice for people who would otherwise be banned from purchasing a gun, including known violent offenders, gun traffickers, and increasingly teenagers whose digital literacy enables them to purchase ghost gun kits freely online. Prior to 2019, Philadelphia police discovered 5 or fewer handmade firearms per year during criminal investigations. But by 2022, 525 ghost guns turned up in investigations, and that number has only grown. Last summer, the mass shooter who killed 5 people in the Concessing neighborhood had 2 ghost guns in his possession when he was arrested. Recently, Delaware County was rocked when a 15-year-old killed another 15-year-old using a ghost gun. These guns are reaching into every community, including the heartland, and not just our big cities. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the number of ghost guns seized by law enforcement has skyrocketed in the last decade, from less than 3,000 in 2017 to nearly 26,000 in 2022 alone. They've become a lucrative business for gun traffickers. In the last couple years, district attorneys in 3 suburban and rural counties near Philadelphia have busted gun traffickers assembling and selling ghost guns for profit. In one instance, the trafficker had set up shop across the street from the county courthouse. This has to stop. We hear all the time from lawmakers who oppose gun safety laws that we should focus on violent crime. Well, that's exactly what H.R. 4992, the Ghost Guns and Untraceable Firearms Act of 2023, would do. There's no reason why anyone would want an untraceable gun that can be purchased without a background check, except to use it in a crime. As Chairman Jordan likes to say, bad guys aren't stupid, they're just bad. But this bill has been waiting for consideration since it was referred to the House Judiciary Committee nearly a year ago. In the absence of federal action, cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and LA have been forced to undertake creative legal strategies, like suing ghost gun manufacturers to block them from selling these guns without background checks. But that's far from enough to stem the tide. The White House also stepped up to issue a regulation that would require ghost guns to be traceable and subject to background checks. But that regulation has been challenged in the Supreme Court. And get this, the argument is that the White House cannot regulate guns because it's Congress's job to regulate guns. Well, it's time for Congress to stop arming people who should not have access to guns. Members of Congress need to make a choice. Will they stand with Americans who want to live free from gun violence, or will they stay in the pocket of ghost gun manufacturers? Americans, our children, deserve to know where their representatives stand.
So listen, we just don't need to choose this. Our kids being hunted in their schools, living lives of terror. In 2 months, we're going to go to the polls, and we are going to make a choice. Donald Trump advertises that he is going to put the profits of the gun industry before the health of our kids. He says he's going to roll back the progress that we have made during the Biden-Harris administration to be a little bit more thoughtful about who gets their hands on weapons. Kamala Harris says that she will work to ban AR-15s, these assault weapons. That you don't need to protect your home. You don't need AR-15s to hunt. You only need them if you want to commit mass murder. Kamala Harris says that she'll work to pass universal background checks. That's supported by 90% of Americans. The idea that you shouldn't be able to buy a gun unless you can prove you're not a criminal or you don't have a history of serious mental illness. You don't want to live in a world where our kids are gunned down in our schools? Then go to the polls this November and support candidates, including Kamala Harris, who are going to take our kids' safety seriously and make sure you don't put in office people like Donald Trump, who are literally screaming from the rooftops to you that they are not going to give a shit about our kids and are going to care only about how much money the gun industry makes.
In the last few years, more than 20 states, including New York, have passed new laws restricting how people can buy and carry guns. But we're seeing data that indicates there's a thriving underground market for guns. Can you talk about your 2022 interstate task force to stop the illegal trafficking of guns?
When I took office 3 years ago, we were in the throes of a major crime wave, nationwide, not just New York. It was a nationwide phenomenon. And my husband was the United States Attorney for Barack Obama, and I saw how collaboration can help and eradicate crime. And I thought, why don't we harness the power of not just New York State, but all of our neighbors? Because 80% of the guns in New York come from out of state. We don't manufacture them. So there is a pipeline that's bringing these guns right to the streets of New York, and we have to stop that. So I reached out to other governors. We had 9 at first. We now have 12 states that are all contiguous. And if we're sharing data, identifying perpetrators, stopping them at the border, we can stop the flow of illegal guns from coming into our state. And the numbers have been incredibly successful. The number of gun interdictions, about 9,500. We've taken 10,000 guns off the streets. I mean, these are numbers that were just escalating year after year until someone finally says, we're going to work together. I'll put the resources behind it. We have spent over $800 million directly on gun interdiction measures, another $1 billion to help support our local communities for the gun violence disruptor program. So combined, almost $2 billion in 3 years to say no more slaughter in my state.
Mm-hmm. Following our conversation here, I'm going to dive in with our panelists on community-based solutions and approaches that they're doing on the ground throughout the country. We know that these solutions from the communities themselves are promising toward reducing gun-related injuries and killings. In a similar vein, from your perch, what do you see as promising solutions and approaches to the issue?
It does absolutely come down to engaging the community. They're the ones who are victimized. They're the ones who often see perpetrators. They're the ones who have evidence that can come forward. But also, how do we change the hearts and minds of particularly young men, young kids in these neighborhoods who think that the only alternative they have is to be part of a gang because they're not getting the love and nurture they need at home. This becomes their family. And that is what's so tragic about this. But what you can do with these violence disruptor programs, and we've funded so many of them all across the state, is that oftentimes these might be former gang members. These are people who've been involved with the law. And so they're the ones who have the story to say, don't make the same mistake I did. And if we fund them and increase the number of them in every community, they are making a real difference. So I'm going to continue focusing on not just the law enforcement side, which has been quite extraordinary, and we've had to change our laws. And back to changing our laws, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down a law that we had on the books for over 100 years, a concealed carry law that says you should not be able to walk into this venue right now with a gun in your pocket, go on our subways, walk around Times Square. And the Supreme Court took that power away from me as the governor of New York to protect my citizens. And I said the next day, we're fighting back. We're going to structure a different law. We'll go right up to the line to where we can go. And now we've identified sensitive locations, which is a large part of New York, where you cannot carry a gun, including Times Square and houses of worship and other places. So I had to come around and do an end run, basically, around what the Supreme Court was trying to do and taking away my rights. So the violence disruptor programs, the massive funding into law enforcement, the community policing, the interdiction at the borders with our consortium is making a difference to a point where our murders are down almost to the 1960s levels, which is extraordinary. And 1 year we had, 1990, we had 2,600 murders in the state of New York. We're trending to be about 350 this year. I mean, look at the difference in that. It's gone, shootings are down 47% since I became governor because we had an intentional strategy that said, we're not going to lose any more lives senselessly to guns. And again, the laws are so important. The laws that we have on the books, the red flag laws. We had about 1,300 extreme risk orders of protection. When you identify someone who shows a propensity to do harm to themselves or to others, someone sees that red flag, a school counselor, a family member, law enforcement, a principal, a teacher, someone's seeing this behavior, someone's watching it, and they don't think they have the power to do something about it, but we said you do have the power. And by changing the law to say you are required to notify the authorities so they can identify whether they have access to a gun, we have had a 1,300% increase in the number of extreme risk orders of protections where other states aren't doing anything. And this should be a national policy. This should be a national policy passed by Congress because we have taken guns out of the hands that we know from people that could do harm to others before there's a tragedy that happens. This is what smart policies are all about, getting there before you have to go to another funeral of a child. And that's what I want to continue doing here in New York, and I hope other states will follow suit.
The Supreme Court stands poised to knock down any legislation, attempts to legislate the gun violence epidemic. You mentioned going right up to the line. What is that line? What can you do? What can't you do?
We weren't allowed to ban concealed carry weapons, but I put in place more restrictions on who can apply for them. Okay? We are able to look at your social media. That's where people are telegraphing what they're going to do. That was our Buffalo killer. It was all out there on social media. It's often out there. People are telegraphing what they're going to do. And if you can't be aware of that, you can't see what's out there about them, then you're not protecting yourself or society. My number one job as governor of the state of New York is to protect our citizens, full stop. And this is part of that strategy. So we have more requirements on background checks. Our background checks are very strong. But even if someone is able to secure a concealed weapon permit, and many of them are legitimate. There's people in security, and there are legitimate purposes that I will agree with. But it's time, place, and manner. And again, I don't want them on the streets of New York. I don't think that's I don't think it should be in a schoolyard. That's not appropriate. A playground. So many places they don't make sense. So we went right when they said, I can't ban them, I said, but they threw some words about sensitive places, and I defined sensitive places in New York, and our law is holding.
Wonderful.
So far.
Wonderful. You mentioned violence diversion programs. What's entailed in these programs?
We fund an enormous number of these. We know the neighborhoods where they need them. These are individuals who, community-based organizations. SNUG is one of them. It's just guns spelled backwards. It's one I was familiar with in Buffalo, New York. Like I said, I have a family member in law enforcement, a prosecutor, and I saw the power of these organizations when they got together. I did a lot of events with them. We announced a lot of funding for them all over the state. And what they do is they develop relationships. They intervene because if the young person has a strong role model at home, both parents, one parent, grandparents, someone that's taking care of them and watching them and knows where they are after school and keep an eye on them, there's not likely to be a problem. But that's not the reality for so many families in so many of our communities. The parents have to work. The mom has to work. And there's no one there after school. And this is where the temptation is great to find alternatives. These members, like I said, many of them have done time themselves. They can speak truth to what they saw. They're credible messengers that are the only ones who can break through and make a difference. And they've been successful, and I'll keep supporting them over and over and over again as part of a holistic strategy. But another part of that strategy deals with mental health. We have seen the radicalization of people on social media, but also our teenagers many of them are despairing. And I've seen this because I've convened countless roundtables with teenagers over the last year as I look at social media, the effect it has on how their well-being, how they feel about themselves, and also cell phones in schools. I mean, this is an issue I'm looking intensely at because kids are spiraling. They're not paying attention in class. They're being bullied all day long. They don't have a break from it. And one young woman said to me at one of our forums, you have to save us from ourselves. You have to help us. You have to stand up and say, we shouldn't be doing this because we can't do it alone. So that's only tangentially related to gun violence, but it also goes to the psychology of people. And if we're not helping children and teenagers be healthy now, what are we supposed to expect from them when they turn to adults? We're supposed to not just raise children, but raise adults who are healthy and fully functioning and have human connections that they're being denied right now, the way this device has taken over their lives.
I have to wrap up here, but one more question. If there's one key message that you'd like the audience here to walk away with, what would it be?
We have seen in New York State that leadership that is committed to ensuring that you look at all the levers at our disposal, the platforms we have, the ability to change law. There are ways that we can stop gun violence in this country. We can be like the other countries who are gathering in our city right now that don't know a fraction of the shootings we have. It's the accessibility to guns. I continue to call on Congress to do the right thing and reinstate the ban on assault weapons that was so effective for an entire decade until it was repealed. That's number one. Call on other states to do as we've done with the red flag law. Just pass what we did here in New York, and you could have prevented so many of the mass shootings. As every time you look at and analyze the social media and the footprint that's out there for these shooters, it's always telegraphed in advance. You can, and there's always someone who says, "Yeah, I kind of thought that kid was." Something wrong was there. The evidence is there. We have to give people the responsibility to report it to law enforcement, let them get the order protection, and let's start protecting people. That's what this is all about. So I would say, don't give up hope. I mean, the situation is dire. It is spiraling. One more mass shooting on the news is just making us sick, and it's taking us to a dark place. But it does not have to be that way. I reject the notion that this has to be our destiny. There are policies out there that are working. Otherwise, how do we cut shootings down 47%? This is all since I've been governor in just a few years. Look at the impact that we have had here in the state of New York. I want every state to be just like that. And then we start reclaiming our kids and our safety and the mental health that we need to know that we are safe in our country.
Governor Hochul, thank you so much for being here.
Colleague from Colorado, Representative Joe Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank the distinguished gentleman, my good friend from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, whose leadership with respect to addressing the scourge of gun violence that has unfortunately taken hold in so many parts of our country has been unparalleled since he first stepped into this august chamber last year. We're grateful for his service, we're grateful for his leadership, and we're grateful for him initiating this important conversation tonight. I must say that there are many constituents of mine who are frustrated, who are outraged, who are anguished at the inaction of this body to address an issue as fundamental as this one. What could be more important, Mr. Speaker, than the safety of our families, of our friends, of our neighbors, of our colleagues, of our children, of our fellow citizens? This Congress has a job to do, and that job must include addressing gun violence and enacting common sense reforms that we know will save lives. I have the distinct privilege, Mr. Speaker, of representing the great state of Colorado, and we have been no stranger to the anguish of gun violence. Next week will mark the 25th anniversary of the tragic and devastating massacre at Columbine High School. 13 Coloradans murdered, cold blood. 12 students and 1 teacher, 25 years ago next week. 3 years ago, my community was devastated by yet another mass shooting at our local grocery store. 10 community members, Mr. Speaker, gunned down, including 1 police officer who bravely died in the line of duty, saving lives, making the ultimate sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, we have lost far too many. There are far too many mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, children, Americans dying from gun violence. We have the power to stop it if we follow the articulate admonition of my friend and colleague, Mr. McGarvey, by passing common sense solutions here in this chamber. And for those who doubt our ability to do so, Mr. Speaker, I will point you to fairly recent history. There were many who doubted the ability of the United States Congress and the President to enact laws, common sense laws, that ultimately would and could save lives. They were wrong. Because of President Biden's leadership, we passed a bill in the last Congress, the 117th Congress, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That law is saving lives today. Earlier today, the White House, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, the leadership of our Attorney General Garland, announced yet another reform, a new rule pursuant to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that will finally close the gun show loophole. An important step forward, Mr. Speaker, and one that I applaud. And I sincerely hope that it can be a building block for us to take on. Now, I have to confess, I looked at the notice from the Rules Committee on which I serve, with great dismay just a few short hours ago. What did that notice portend for next week? What have House Republicans decided we will spend our time on next week? Not gun violence prevention. The Refrigerator Freedom Act. I kid you not. That is literally on the agenda next week. Refrigerator Freedom Act. How about a bill to address gun violence? Is that too much to ask? My constituents don't think so. And I don't think the people of Kentucky think so either. I thank the gentleman from Kentucky again for his leadership, for initiating this important conversation. It is the beginning and not the end. I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, Representative.
Last month, I joined my colleague, Jared Moskowitz, on a tour of the Marjorie Stoneham Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The school is frozen in time. It's just as it was 6 years ago today when a gunman stole the lives of 17 people. There was a box of chocolates left in a classroom on a stack of textbooks, a stuffed animal with a Valentine's Day balloon sitting on a chair, writing assignments left unfinished, whiteboards covered in lesson plans. It was so ordinary, so hauntingly familiar. It's what you would see today if you walked into any high school on Valentine's Day. And then there was the horror, the broken glass, the bullet holes, the blood stains, the outlines left by children's murdered bodies, 2 of them right next to the teacher's desk where their classmates and teacher were hiding, inches away. 3 dads joined us that day. One by one, each of them led us to a spot where his child had been shot to death. One told us of how his daughter had run for safety into a stairwell, how she had missed safety by a split second, how a single bullet ended her life before it had even begun. Her blood and the blood of her classmates mark the floors of that hallway, and they mark the soul of a country that could have saved them but chose not to. The collective failure to prevent this tragedy permeates every corner of that building and every corner of this building. The failure of the good guys with guns to respond quickly and without hesitation. The sheriff's failure to act on a warning of a school shooter in the making. The FBI's failure to investigate a tip about an angry, unstable teenager who wanted to kill people. And Congress's failure to keep an AR-15 rifle out of his hands. The men and women in this building could have prevented him from acquiring a weapon designed to kill and kill fast. But no, nothing. No red flag laws, no universal background checks, no crackdown on high-capacity magazines, no assault weapons ban, no safe storage requirements. All of it rejected by those, Madam Speaker, who perversely define freedom as unfettered access to weapons of war. Madam Speaker, there was no freedom for the students and staff gunned down that day. There is no freedom in violence, in terror, and death. There is no freedom in being forced to wonder if your child will come home from school. Will they live to see graduation? And there is no freedom from the grief of those parents whose worst fears have been realized. Along one of those hallways, there's a quote painted on the wall. Never live in the past, but always learn from it. Madam Speaker, that building is just as it was 6 years ago, and so is this country. Our gun laws are frozen in the past as if nothing has happened. In refusing to act, Republicans not only ignore the past, they condemn the children to future violent death. Madam Speaker, let us honor our past by changing our future. Let us honor the murdered by honoring the right of the living to be free from fear. I yield back.
The chair.
Without objection, the gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise today to celebrate President Biden's historic gun safety accomplishments. The Biden administration recently closed a loophole that let unlicensed dealers sell guns without a background check. This action clarifies who qualifies as a gun dealer, and it gives the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives the ability to hold gun sellers accountable to the American people. This is just one example of President Biden's commitment to tackling gun violence. The White House also created the first Office of Gun Violence Prevention to investigate how to reduce gun violence and create safer communities. Each death from gun violence is one too many. Congress needs to step up and do its part to stop preventable gun violence. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the
Director, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and specifically how the engaged in the business language may have broadened your ability to perform background checks, and what impact that then has on other agencies' ability to successfully prosecute things like the straw purchasing and gun trafficking provisions in that law.
So certainly BISCA was an important piece of legislation that has added to our authorities at NICS in particular in a number of ways in terms of additional background checks for the so-called U21 group in particular. And I think that's important because as I go around talking to state and local law enforcement, and I've been in talked to law enforcement in all 50 states, I believe, easily in this job. One of the two recurring themes you'll hear on violent crime is the role of juveniles and the role of mental health. almost every group, no matter what state I'm talking to. And so the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act does, I think, take an important step in the right direction in terms of addressing that specific part of the threat. The part that you're asking about is more in ATF's lane, but we work very closely with ATF on our Safe Streets and Violent Crimes Task Forces, and we're always looking for the strongest violation to disrupt the threat. And so whether it's straw purchaser cases or things like that, I know when I was a line prosecutor, I tried a number of straw purchaser cases. Those are important tools. And so often that's one of the best violations to kind of dismantle a violent crime threat.
One of the other things that we haven't, I don't think, adequately addressed in the law yet, but which is skyrocketing, is these ghost guns or privately made firearms. Law enforcement has seen a 1,000% increase in recoveries between 2016 and 2021. In 2022, we had a ghost gun was used to shoot and kill a 16-year-old at West Mesa High School in Albuquerque. And I wish that were a completely isolated case. What is the FBI doing to recover and prevent assembly of ghost guns? And what tools, maybe even more importantly, do you need from the Congress to be able to get your hands around this challenge?
So I would say ghost guns, as you say, represent a real challenge for law enforcement because the kits are cheap and widely available and undercut the ability to trace the firearm and in effect end up undermining the background investigation process. And unfortunately, we are seeing ghost guns more and more in violent crime and gang investigations. Now, as to authorities, you're really talking more ATF in terms of regulation or even legislation, but we do coordinate closely. Whenever we seize ghost guns as part of a takedown, we're obviously working closely with ATF on that. As to other things that Congress can do to help, at the risk of answering every question with the same answer, we need Congress to restore the progress that was made in 23 so that we can sustain our efforts against violent crime and sustain our work in terms of denials of firearms to the people who are legally prohibited from having them.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, and I suspect it will be a similar answer, we made some progress recently with the Fentanyl Act that was really designed to prevent fentanyl from getting inside the United States in the first place, but you have to deal with it once it's already here. You mentioned funding and the potential impact that the budget could have on your ability to disrupt that flow. Feel free to reiterate the importance of that and then also touch on other tools that you may need that to address the sort of crisis that we are seeing in communities all across this country.
So we are finding most of the fentanyl that we seize at the FBI is fentanyl that's already here in the United States, and what we're finding is that something like 70% of it is coming up in violent gang takedowns. So that shows you kind of firsthand the nexus between the fentanyl problem and the violent crime problem and some of the most dangerous offenders. And it is not unusual for the FBI, for any given field office, to seize enough fentanyl in one takedown to have wiped out an entire state. God. And so if you start thinking about the impact of the cuts that we've been talking about in this hearing, that's fewer seizures. That's more pills on the market. That's more people dying. I mean, just put it as bluntly as that. And that's just looking at it that way. And of course, we also have all these investigations into cartel leadership. And again, the cuts impact that if we're going to be serious about going after the cartels. Among the other things that we're doing to try to tackle the fentanyl problem, we have an initiative called J-Code that aggressively targets darknet trafficking of fentanyl. We just last year had an operation called Spector that was the largest ever, I think, takedown of darknet trafficking marketplace of fentanyl and other dangerous, synthetic opioids. So that's an important part of our work. I know in your home state of Albuquerque, I just remembered off the top of my head, was a great takedown that they did where they were seizing enough fentanyl to wipe out like an entire state, along with, again, back to the nexus with violence, along with hand grenades, ballistic vests, you know, the whole 9 yards. So the fentanyl problem and the violent crime problem are inextricably linked, and of course the fentanyl problem is directly tied to the problems from the other side of the border.
So not a great time to cut his budget.
Certainly it's not. It's unfortunate we have another
courage in trying to save lives, especially the lives of our children, and trying to, again, to address the crisis that we have in our country. It is an honor, always an honor, to be able to serve the families of the 12th Congressional District in Michigan. Before I was a congresswoman, my 2 sons made me a mother. And I'm speaking to you all as a mother, more than anything. And it is important to understand, this is a true fact, that gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and teens in our country. As of today, there have already been 106 mass shootings. That's more mass shootings than the days in the year so far. And you know what's more horrific? The fact that gun violence in our communities that is happening every single day doesn't even make the news anymore. Congress has become so numb, this institution, truly numb to the gun violence crisis in our country, that they're not even paying attention any longer. We cannot continue like this, Mr. Speaker. I refuse to accept that the death of kids is the status quo. We have not voted on a single gun violence prevention bill under this Republican majority. Guns now have more rights in our country than women do. It's sick. It's disgusting that campaign donations from the NRA and gun manufacturers have bought inaction and bought the silence of many. How many times do we have to come to the floor to demand that our colleagues take action to end the gun violence crisis that is traumatizing our children and tearing families apart? Since Republicans took power, the Speaker has not called not one single vote, not one, to combat gun violence. And it's shameful. It's shameful because since then, 934 mass shootings have occurred in our country. Just this past weekend, Mr. Speaker, in northeast side of our city, there was a mass shooting where 2 people were killed and 19 others severely injured. The victims were all between the ages of 17 and 27 years old. I refuse to accept this as normal or the status quo. I refuse to accept that last month a mass shooting at a splash pad with families in Rochester Hills, Michigan, where 9 people were shot, including 2 children, that is okay, that is normal. Behind these numbers are real people in our communities, families who are directly forever again impacted and traumatized by these senseless shootings. Firearms are now the leading cause of death for children and teens in our country. And it's not just mass shootings. 4.6 million children in our country live in homes with loaded and unlocked firearms. I know there's a children's hospital in Detroit that passes out lock boxes. Recently, a 6-year-old boy in Detroit shot himself in the hand at his grandmother's home after he found an unsecured firearm. He was playing with it and accidentally pulls the trigger. He is just one of nearly 360 children who unintentionally shoot themselves or someone else every single year. This cable lock right here, which prevents a gun from being loaded and fired, it's $10. I looked it up. This is why I introduced the Safe Storage, Safe Lives Act to require gun locks like this one to be provided for every firearm sold in our country. This is common sense solution to save lives, to prevent these horrific accidental shootings, and even prevent suicides among our children. It's time for Congress to act with urgency, Mr. Speaker, and pass legislation to save lives now.
You mentioned gun violence. Teachers do active shooter drills with their kids. That wasn't the case when I was in school. It wasn't really the case when my kids were in the Richmond public schools. It's the norm now. And a teacher said to me recently, we all do a moment of silence now. And I don't know what the kids are thinking about, but I know what every adult in a school is thinking about during the moment of silence. And it's let today not be the day. Let today not be the day. And that's got to be daunting for teachers and other adults who work in school systems, just like it's daunting for parents. My kids went to an urban school system, probably 90% free and reduced lunch. I didn't worry when I dropped them off in the morning about picking them up at the end of the day. I didn't worry about it. And they finished school just 15 years ago, but this is something that parents worry about now, teachers worry about now, kids worry about now. I was going to ask that question, Mr. Keyes, about the pathway program, because I think that really is a solution. Senator Collins and I have a bill called the PREP Act that looks at Grow Your Own, because if somebody has been a paraprofessional in a school system and has demonstrated the ability to compassionately deal with all kinds of students, but they don't have the credential yet to be a teacher, you know they're going to be a successful teacher if you can get them to that credential. So I'm a big supporter of programs like the one you describe, and we do have bipartisan legislation to try to advance that here. Mr. Arthur, I wanted to ask you about a part of your background, which was national teacher certification. Dr. Kerwin talked a little bit about this. My experience in Virginia, but I'm wondering about the Utah experiences. Every once in a while in Virginia, we would do a one-time bonus for people that got national teacher certification. But then if the budget was bad next year, it would disappear. So you wouldn't get a continued salary bump, and the person who wanted to get board certified next year wouldn't have that incentive to do it. I think while teacher salary is something that is primarily a state and local responsibility, I think it could at the federal level be a federal thing. We're talking about national certification. If we wanted a high percentage of our teachers to have national certification, that could be something at the federal level that would be smart to incentivize. Talk a little bit about, were you incentivized in Utah to do this? Did you just take it on because you wanted to do it? What was the Utah program under which you became certified, and did it increase your salary?
Absolutely, Senator. I receive a stipend every year, both from my district and my state. When I first went through national board certification, I did so just because I wanted to be better for children. I was motivated by what I was seeing in the classrooms of national board certified teachers. But when someone told me I would get paid more, I was like, okay, all right, that's nice. I won't have to ask my wife so much for the money. And it's not much. It's not enough right now to move people into this. I get about, roughly in Utah, about $4,000 extra year, or every year, because I teach in a Title I school, and I teach in a district that supports that, but not all districts do. States have different programs for this. So if there was a way to make sure that teachers across our country were all incentivized to become the most accomplished educator that they could be, the benefits to our children, the research shows, would be profound.
And Dr. Kerwin, again, remind me of, in the Maryland plan, what do you do around national board certification?
When a teacher becomes board certified, they get an increase in salary of $10,000. And that continues in their salary. It is independent of the year. That's part of their base as long as they are board certified. So when they have to be renewed, they continue. And Senator Kane, it's had a very interesting consequence. I just learned today, in fact, that Maryland led the nation in the number of teachers who got board certified last year. Maryland is a relatively small state, 6 million people, but it led the nation, more than California, more than New York. And I think that that salary increase has been obviously played a big role in making that happen.
And if I could, it's a salary increase, but it's a salary increase for doing a lot of work that makes you a better teacher. And
Absolutely.
The salary increase, even in your case in Utah, where it's somewhat modest, it's a sign of respect. It's a sign of respect for the profession. And so I think that has a number of positives. And
recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, quick request permission to address the House for 5 minutes and advise the Senate.
Gentleman's recognized without objection.
Today is World Suicide Prevention Day and Firearms Suicide Prevention Day. In 2022, almost 50,000 Americans died by suicide. 1.6 million Americans attempted suicide. More than half of all gun deaths in the United States are by suicide. On average, we lose 74 people to a firearm suicide every single day. And the firearm suicide rate among children in the U.S. is growing. More younger Americans are struggling with their mental health than ever before. And we know that when there's a gun in the home, the risk of suicide death jumps by 300%. The result is tragedy. Each of us here in this chamber has an enormous responsibility to serve here in Washington and to help Americans. Yet Americans are dying, and we're doing little to stop it. Something is seriously broken. Gun deaths are not just a fact of life we should accept. Every gun death is preventable, including self-inflicted ones. 70% of those who survive a suicide attempt will never attempt it again. That's a remarkable statistic. 70% of those who survive a suicide attempt won't try it again. Reducing gun deaths in our country isn't a zero-sum proposition. We have to address gun safety and the mental health crisis. It's not getting too political or a cop-out to talk about both. First and foremost, reducing firearm-related suicides can be as simple as storing firearms safely and securely, which means locked, unloaded, and separated from ammunition. Simple, practical steps can reduce impulsive decisions and save lives. The 988 Mental Health Lifeline is already making a huge difference. Not only are millions of Americans calling and texting to get help in a moment of crisis, but even more, simply know where to get help if they need it. We also have to get back to watching out for one another, to building strong, resilient communities where people aren't lonely and isolated behind their screens, and where friends and neighbors recognize the signs when someone is struggling and find the courage to speak out. We can stand together to create a future where no one feels like they have no other choice. Together, we can offer hope, and together, we can save lives. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.